The following dawn, the camp was restless. Men moved about with unease, their eyes shifting often toward the ridge where she had been seen the night before. The whispers had not faded, they had grown until even the youngest recruit spoke her story. With reverence, the number 3,247 now lingered on every tongue. The chief felt the weight of it pressing against the air, as though the camp itself was haunted by the shot. He rose early and sought her out, determined to cut through the fog of rumor with direct truth. He found her seated alone at the far edge of the range, the Barrett across her lap, the metal glinting dull in the morning light. She cleaned it with steady hands, every motion precise and deliberate, as though the rifle itself was not a weapon, but a living companion she had carried through endless nights. The chief approached, slow, his boots crunching against the gravel. She did not raise her eyes yet. He knew she was aware of his presence. He stood before her for a long moment waiting, but her silence stretched heavy, so he spoke at last, asking if the stories were hers, asking if the record belonged to her, asking what had happened on that mountain. She paused, the cloth in her hand, resting. Still against the barrel, her eyes finally lifting to meet his, and in them he saw no fear, no hesitation, only the steady gaze of someone who had long ago abandoned the weight of doubt. She did not confirm, she did not deny. Instead, she asked him softly why he wanted to know, why he could not let the silence remain unbroken. The chief told her that silence breeds fear more than bullets, that soldiers needed to know whether they followed a myth or a reality. He told her he had read the reports, that he had pieced together the fragments, and that he believed she had done the impossible. But belief was not enough. He needed to hear it from her lips. Her gaze hardened. She looked away toward the horizon where the mountains rose, distant and blue. She spoke quietly, almost too low for him to hear, saying only that mountains never forget, and neither do those who fire across them. He felt the words strike like stone, for they carried the weight of memory far heavier than confession. She laid the cloth aside and lifted the Barrett, resting it across her knees, as if the rifle itself held the story he demanded. He pressed her again, asking who the target was. What kind of man demanded a shot across 3,247 meters? Her silence returned, but this time it was not empty. It was full of tension, full of meaning, her hands brushing across the scope slowly, as though she could see once again the faint figure in the distance waiting, unaware. Finally she said one line, the kind of man who thought no bullet could reach him, and nothing more. She would not give a name. She would not give a place, but in her eyes he saw the image of a general standing proud upon a ridge, believing himself untouchable until the mountains whispered otherwise. The chief felt a chill crawl through him, for the confirmation lay not in her words, but in the storm that flickered behind her gaze. The men nearby had gathered, watching from a distance, sensing the gravity of the moment. The whispers fell into silence, their eyes fixed on her and the chief, as though the truth might spill into the air. At any second she rose to her feet, the Barrett slung across her shoulder, her figure tall against the early sun. She turned to the chief and said, "If you need proof, look to the mountains, for they remember what men forget." She began to walk away, her steps slow and deliberate, the silence trailing behind her, thicker than the echo of gunfire. The chief did not stop her. He stood frozen. The fragments of truth now whole in his mind, though still unspoken aloud, he knew she had done it. He knew the number belonged to her. Yet without her words, the legend would remain both myth and reality at once. The soldiers watched her vanish into the haze, some whispering prayers, others simply staring as if they had seen a ghost. The chief clenched his fists, torn between pressing her further and respecting the wall she had built around herself. But he knew one thing: the silence could not hold forever. One day the full story would break from her lips, or from the shadows of the past. That night, as the camp settled under the stars, he saw her again alone at the ridge, her figure still, her rifle resting at her side, her gaze fixed outward across the horizon as though searching for another target beyond sight. And he felt that whatever truth she carried, it was not finished. It was not only memory, it was a warning of something yet to come. And in that moment, the chief understood the silence was not the end. It was the beginning. The final days of the training cycle hung heavy over the camp, the air thick with tension, as if every man felt the shadow of something larger than drills, larger than orders. The whispers had spread beyond the tents, beyond the fences, until even visiting officers arrived already asking about her. They did not use her name. They simply asked, "Is it true? Is she the one?" And no answer was ever given, only the silence that followed, and the silence said more than words ever could. The SEAL chief watched the camp unravel beneath the weight of the rumor. He saw men train with sharper focus, as though being near her demanded they rise to her standard. He saw others avoid her eyes, as though the truth they suspected burned too brightly to confront. She carried herself the same as always, calm, deliberate, steady. But he sensed a storm building inside her, and he knew it would break. Before long, one evening, he found her at the far edge of the range, the Barrett resting. On its bipod pointed into the horizon, though no target stood there. She lay prone, her cheek against the stock. Her eyes through the scope, her breath measured, as though she were once again waiting across days. For a single moment, he approached quietly and crouched beside her, asking why she never confirmed the truth, why she let the whispers grow unchecked. She did not move at first. Then she spoke softly, saying that silence was heavier than fame. Silence kept men guessing, and guessing bred fear. And fear was more powerful than a name in a report. The chief listened, and he understood in part, but still he pressed her, asking if she feared the truth itself. Asking if the burden of the record haunted her, she pulled her eye from the scope and turned her head slowly, her gaze locking onto his, her voice low but steady. She said, "A record is nothing, a distance is nothing. What matters is the man who believed he was beyond reach, and how he fell when the mountain itself spoke through my rifle." The chief felt the words strike like a hammer, and in them he heard not pride but warning. The days stretched on, and the tension grew. She spoke little, but her presence loomed over the campmen. Fired their rifles with more care, men held their breath. Longer steadied their hands, longer. Yet they knew none of them could match what she had done. The number haunted them as much as it haunted her. It became a weight they carried into their sleep and into their waking hours. The chief knew he should end the cycle with a formal debrief with reports signed and filed away, but he could not bring himself to reduce her to ink on paper. He walked the perimeter each night and often found her already there, standing silent at the ridge, her figure carved. Against the stars, the Barrett across her back, her eyes lost in the distance. She seemed less a soldier and more a part of the landscape itself, an echo of the mountain she spoke of. On the final night, he confronted her once more, not as a commander, not as a keeper of records, but as a man who had walked through too many wars. He asked her if she would ever speak the full truth, if she would ever share the name of the man who fell the mission that demanded such a shot. She looked at him with eyes that carried the weight of frost and fire, and she said only one thing: "If I speak the name, the silence dies, and with it dies the fear." Then she turned and walked into the darkness. Her steps slow, her rifle resting easy at her side, and the chief did not follow. He stood there watching her vanish into the night, knowing he would not stop her even if he could. For some truths lived only in silence, and her silence had become more powerful than any record. The next morning she was gone, no trace. Left in the camp, her tent empty. Her presence erased as though she had never been there at all, except for the whispers that remained, the number 3247, still spoken by men who had seen her eyes and knew the truth. Without hearing it aloud, The chief stood at the range, alone, staring at the targets, and he felt the silence pressing against him heavier than the crack of any rifle. He realized then that the legend was no longer hers, alone. It had become theirs. It had become his. It would travel with them across battlefields, across oceans, carried in hushed voices at firesides and in barracks, and the legend would grow. Not because she confirmed it, but because she never did. And in that space between truth and silence, the story became immortal. The SEAL chief lowered his head, his hands clenched at his sides. He felt a chill move through him, not from the wind, but from the certainty that she was still out there somewhere, watching, waiting, perhaps already, lining up another shot across another impossible distance, and he knew that one day the silence would break. Not with words, but with the thunder of her rifle, and when it did, the world would remember again. Morning came heavy with mist rolling low across the training ground, the air damp with silence, broken only by the echo of boots and the faint clatter of rifles being prepared for another day. The SEAL chief walked with purpose, his mind locked on. The same thought that had kept him awake through the night. He would speak to her. He would break through the wall of silence that surrounded her and find out the truth that lay hidden behind her eyes. She was already at the range before the others, her Barrett leaning against a crate, her posture still as stone. She stood facing the targets, distant and blurred by fog, her hands clasped behind her back, her breathing slow. The chief paused for a moment, studying her, and once again he felt that strange weight that pressed against him whenever she was near. It was not intimidation. It was something deeper, something older, as though she carried the ghosts of forgotten battles with her. He approached, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. She did not turn. She did not acknowledge him yet. He knew she had already registered his presence. Her awareness felt constant, like a shadow that never wavered. He stopped beside her and spoke in a low, steady tone, asking how long she had trained. With the Barrett, her reply was silence, her eyes fixed on the distant targets, as if the fog itself held answers no man could see. The chief tried again, asking where she had learned such control, such patience, such precision. Finally, she turned her head slightly, her eyes cutting toward him sharp and unblinking. She said only one word. Mountains then turned away again, and the word hung in the air, heavy with more meaning than a sentence could hold. Mountains. It could have been anywhere. Yet he knew there was truth buried inside it, and he felt a chill crawl across his spine. He pressed further, asking which mountains, asking who had been there with her, asking if the stories he had heard were true. But she only lifted the Barrett into her arms, the weight of it carried with ease. She moved toward the firing line, her boots steady against the damp ground, her silence unbroken. The chief followed, keeping his gaze on her as if every step might reveal the answer he sought. She set the rifle. Down her movements, precise each gesture, flowing into the next, as though rehearsed 1,000 times. She lay prone, her cheek against the stock, her eyes through the scope, the fog still thick, but her body calm, as if she could see beyond it. The chief crouched beside her, whispering the number that haunted him, 3,247. Her finger paused on the trigger. Her breath caught just once before resuming steady and quiet. The shot cracked across the range, shattering the fog. For an instant, the sound rolling back like thunder against mountains unseen. The target shook violently. Dust rising, the men who had gathered to watch murmured among themselves, their voices trembling with awe. The chief kept his eyes on her expression unchanged. But he knew he had touched something inside her by speaking the number. He asked her again. Was it true? Was it her shot? Was it her? Kill, her eyes remained on the scope. Her body still, her breath. Even she said nothing, but in her, silence. He felt the weight of confirmation more powerful than words. He saw it. in the way her hand lingered against the stock. He saw it in the way her eyes refused to leave the distance, as though reliving a moment carved into her soul. The men whispered. Louder now, some saying it must be true, others refusing to believe. The chief ignored them. His focus locked on her. He leaned closer, his voice a harsh whisper demanding to know what target lay at the end of that shot, what enemy had fallen, what mission had carved her name into a number that no one else could match. She exhaled long and steady, then finally lifted her head from the scope, her eyes locking onto his, and in them he saw a storm, a memory etched deep, a weight that could not be lifted. Easily she opened her mouth slightly as if to speak, but stopped closing it again, her gaze sharpening with defiance. She rose from the ground, lifting the Barrett with her, and walked away without a word. The chief remained kneeling, the echoes of her shot still ringing in his ears. He knew now that the truth was hers alone to reveal. But the silence she carried was not the silence of denial. It was the silence of memory, a silence forged in the cold and in the distance of mountains where breath froze and patience was the only shield as she disappeared into the mist. The chief clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. He would uncover the story no matter how deep she buried it, for he knew. The truth was there just beyond reach, and with it lay something greater than legend, something that could change everything. He thought he knew about the art of the rifle. The SEAL chief spent the next days chasing fragments of her past through files and whispers, his nights buried under the dim light of lanterns, his table cluttered with worn folders, faded papers, and maps marked with circles and lines that stretched across continents. He searched not for her name, for he had already learned it would not be there, but for patterns that spoke of her presence without revealing her face. He read reports from mountain campaigns where units had suffered heavy losses. Yet somewhere in the margins, he found notes of a single sniper working alone, a ghost who had held back entire advances with precision fire. He traced mentions of impossible distances of commanders struck down without warning, their men scattering in fear. The details never gave a name, only shadows. Yet he began to feel her shadow walking through those words. The chief dug deeper into records that were never meant to leave locked cabinets. He found testimonies from soldiers who swore they had seen a shot travel further than reason, further than belief, a shot that had cut through wind and distance to end a life. They would not name some of them, spoke with awe, others with dread, but all with the same number. 3,247, always the same. No matter the region, no matter the man telling the tale, at times he wondered if the number had become a myth spread like smoke through the ranks of broken armies. But when he remembered her eyes, the way they had flinched for only a fraction of a breath, when he whispered it on the range, he knew it was not myth. It was memory, and memory carried more weight than any rumor. He left the comfort of reports and walked among the older veterans, those whose scars were not only on their skin but in their voices. He found one man hunched over a cane, his uniform long stripped of color, who spoke of a night in the mountains when silence ruled until a single shot cracked the air and their commander dropped without warning. The man said they never saw who fired, they never heard more than that one round, but it ended the battle before it began. The chief pressed for more, asking the name of the mountain, asking which unit had been struck, asking if they had searched for the shooter. The veteran only shook his head, his eyes glassy with memory, saying the shot had come from nowhere and everywhere at once, that they never even tried to hunt the sniper for fear they would never return, and in his trembling voice the chief heard the echo of her silence. He walked back to camp each night with the weight of what he uncovered growing heavier. His men noticed his distraction. They saw the way he studied her at the range, the way his questions circled her without landing, and they began to whisper, not only about her, but about him. Some said he feared her, others said he admired her, but none understood that he was driven not by fear or respect alone, but by the need for truth. Every night, the chief pieced together more of the puzzle until the fragments began to align into something whole, a mission unmarked in official histories, a target who had fallen in silence, a battlefield where the only record was the distance of the shot. He felt himself drawing closer to the heart of the story, but still the final detail eluded him. Who had she killed with that record shot? What kind of man demanded the patience and precision of 3,247 meters one night? As the wind rattled the tent walls, he found a fragment almost erased a report from a foreign army buried in translations and coded references. It spoke of a general who had fallen without warning, a man whose name had carried weight across borders, his death reported as sudden, unexplained, a mystery that had broken the morale of his forces. The chief read the page again and again, his pulse quickening, for the date aligned with the other fragments, the location fit the mountains she had spoken of in a single word. The report ended with a line that chilled him. It said the shot had been so far that no one believed it until they saw the body. Yet the men who survived never spoke of the battle again. Their silence became legend, their whispers carried by the wind, and in those whispers he now heard her name, though it was never written. The chief leaned back in his chair, the lantern flickering low, the shadows across the tent dancing like ghosts. He felt the truth just beyond his reach, a truth she carried alone. He closed his eyes for a moment and saw her again on the range. The Barrett steady in her hands, the look in her eyes when he spoke, the number. And he knew he had to confront her once more. Outside the camp, the night was still, the stars, sharp above the mountains in the distance. He saw her silhouette against the ridge, her rifle across her back, her figure calm as stone. And he realized she was watching the horizon as though expecting something or someone that had yet to arrive, and the chief knew the next conversation between them would no longer be about rumors, but about truth, and the truth would not come without a cost. The SEAL chief stood at the edge of the range where the air carried the smell of cordite and dust. His eyes followed the shooters one by one, their rifles cracking sharp against the targets lined in the distance. His men were disciplined, steady, in their stance, yet even he could see the nerves in their shoulders, the small imperfections that separated training from war. He had seen enough combat to know who could stand the test and who would crumble when the noise of battle swallowed the world. Then his gaze fell on her, a figure unlike the others, her posture calm, her grip firm on the massive Barrett 50 that rested across her shoulder as though it were nothing more than a common rifle. He felt the weight of that weapon in his own memory, the recoil that could shatter bones if held wrong, the burden of its mass across long marches, and yet she carried it without effort, her breathing slow, her eyes unblinking on the target ahead. The chief narrowed his eyes. He had seen soldiers fire the Barrett. Before, with strain and hesitation, he had even seen seasoned men flinch at the roar it produced. But when she squeezed the trigger, the shot thundered across the field and her body did not shift. Her stance did not falter. The rifle slid back into her shoulder as if it belonged there, as if she had been born with it in her hands. Smoke curled from the muzzle, drifting through the hot air. The target in the distance shook violently, and when the dust cleared, he saw the mark dead. Center, not just luck, not just a lucky trigger pull, but precision born of something far greater than training. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire that had filled the air before it. Every eye on the range turned toward her, but she did not look back. She simply cycled the bolt calm as a shadow and prepared for another shot. The SEAL chief folded his arms. His mind turning, he asked himself where she had come from, who had trained her, and why she had not crossed his path until now. He knew the rosters of the best. He knew the names of the dead and the living. He knew the stories of the legends whispered among soldiers at night. And yet her face was not among them. Her name was unfamiliar, and her silence carried more weight than words. Another shot rang out, the same thunder, the same steady recoil absorbed into her frame, the same perfect hit. The men beside her exchanged uneasy glances, muttering under their breath, some impressed, some doubtful, but all unsettled by the precision of a woman they knew nothing about. The chief remained silent. His eyes locked on her, studying not the rifle, not the shot, but the composure behind it. He had learned long ago that the weapon was only a tool. It was the person who defined the bullet. She paused after the second round, her gaze fixed on the distant target, as if she were not merely firing at steel, but at something far away. Something only she could see, her breathing steady, her finger light upon the trigger. The stillness of her form reminded him of hunters he had once seen deep in the wilderness, patient as stone until the moment to strike revealed itself. He felt in his chest that there was more to her than a simple display of skill. The men resumed their firing, but their shots felt like noise against her silence. They struck their targets. Some missed, some adjusted their stance, but none carried the weight of inevitability that her rounds carried. She did not fire again. She simply held the rifle steady, her cheek against the stock, her eyes through the scope, as if waiting for something unseen, something that no one else could anticipate. The SEAL chief stepped forward, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. Yet she did not flinch. She did not glance his way, her concentration unbroken. He stopped beside her and waited. Saying nothing for words would have shattered the stillness, and he did not wish to break it. He only wished to understand who she was and why his instincts screamed that. She was not ordinary. Finally, she lowered the Barrett, resting it against the ground with careful ease, her face unreadable, her eyes sharp as glass. She turned and looked at him for the first time, and in that brief glance, he felt a weight that pressed against him, heavier than the recoil of the 50 he had carried through wars. It was not arrogance in her stare. It was not challenge. It was something deeper, something that told him she had seen further than most soldiers would ever see. The chief opened his mouth to speak, but stopped, for the silence between them carried more than words ever could, and in that silence he felt a question rise, one that would not leave him. Who was she really, and what past did those eyes hide? The day after, the chief saw her fire the Barrett. The camp was buzzing with whispers. Men moved between tents with low voices, their words half hidden yet heavy with curiosity. For none of them had seen anyone handle that rifle with such calm precision. Some said she was a ghost from another war. Others claimed she was trained in places no one spoke about aloud, and the rumors grew with each telling until even the most seasoned began to wonder what truth hid behind her silence. The chief walked among them, listening. Though he said nothing, he knew how stories spread in camps, stories that turned men into legends before their time and others into myths that outlived them. But something about her was different. He could feel it in the weight of the air when she stepped onto the range. He could see it in the hesitation of the younger soldiers when they looked her way. She was no myth, yet her presence already carried the shadow of one. At night, he sat in his tent with old files spread before him, reports gathered. From battles across mountains, deserts, and forests, he had seen many names written and crossed out, names of those who had fought and died, names of those who had vanished into the fog of war. But as he turned each page, he found nothing of her, no record, no detail, no mention. It was as though she had walked out of the earth with the rifle in her hands. The silence around her was louder than any gunfire he had heard. She did not speak more than necessary. Her words clipped short like cut wire, her eyes often distant, as if she were still watching something that no one else could see, and the chief began to wonder what battlefield still lived in her mind. For he knew too well that war never truly left its mark on stone. It left it inside, the ones who carried it home. Some of the men claimed she had waited days without food or sleep, hidden in the snow for a single target. Others whispered she had fought in the deserts, where heat turned breath to fire and sandstorms swallowed armies. None of them could agree on the place or the year, but all of them spoke the same number, 3,247 a distance, so impossible that even the chief felt a shiver when he heard it repeated again and again like a prayer. Thought of the Barrett in her hands, the way she had fired without flinch, without pause, and he wondered if the rumors could be true. He knew of long shots taken in war. He had heard the names of men who had pushed the limits of rifles beyond reason. But this number was higher farther than anything he had ever read in official reports. If she had truly done it, then she was not simply skilled, she was something beyond the measure of ordinary soldiers. The chief confronted one of his senior men, asking where the story had begun, but the man only shook his head, saying it had no beginning. It had always been there, carried by those who claimed to know someone who had seen it, though none could prove it, and yet the details remained the same. The impossible distance, the single shot, the silence that followed, and the target that never rose again. That night the chief could not sleep. He sat outside under the dim light of the stars, the weight of curiosity pressing against his chest. He thought of her again on the range, the calm way she held the weapon, the patience in her stance, as though the shot was not the purpose, but the waiting itself. He remembered the way she had looked at him just once, her eyes steady and cold as though daring him to ask the question he had not spoken aloud. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of the guard towers above, and in that silence he realized the whispers were not fading, they were growing. The men spoke her story with more conviction. Each day, and even those who had doubted now leaned toward belief the myth was hardening into fact, and the chief knew he could not let it pass. Unanswered, he had to know what truth lived behind that number. He rose to his feet and looked toward the dark silhouette of the range where she had stood, the Barrett resting like a natural extension of her body. He clenched his jaw and promised himself that he would uncover her past, no matter how deep it lay buried, because he could not shake the feeling that the rumors were not stories but fragments of something real. And as he turned back toward his tent, he saw her walking in the distance alone, her shadow long under the pale moon, her rifle across her back, her steps silent and deliberate, as though she were moving not through the camp, but through some other battlefield still alive within her, and the chief knew the next step was coming, and it would change everything he thought he knew.